Welcome back to the Great Compromise podcast. I am Victoria the Democrat, and with me as always is GOP Jim. Today we are talking about private prisons, or for-profit prisons. So what is a for-profit prison? It is a private company that owns and operates the prison and charges the government to house inmates.
So that's what private prisons are, but why are we talking about them today?
I thought it'd be interesting to research private prisons. I've always heard the negatives. I think that private prisons have a negative connotation. They're making profit off of imprisoning people for their crimes. It just has kind of like a unethical feeling around it. So I wanted to learn more about it, learn if it really is as unethical as it feels. I know that Biden had an executive order against them a couple years back and everything. So I just wanted to know more about it as a topic. So it was interesting reading some of the pros for private prisons because it's not something that you really hear talked about very much. Some pros are that apparently private prisons take some pressure off of the federal prisons to relieve overcrowding and just too much overwhelm in the prison system overall. If there's not enough staff or like system around the prison to do a good job of running it smoothly, then they can offload either mild or moderate security inmates to private prisons. They don't take high security death row inmates or people that are severely ill, but they will take mild or moderate security inmates. And so that is supposed to make it like a safer environment, especially in COVID, because overcrowding has added risk these days.
Sure. Yeah.
But it's also supposed to make it a better living condition and working condition for everybody. But then to every pro, there's an argument, right? There's a con. And so depending on what you're reading, people say that actually that's not true, that people that work at private prisons are not paid as well as federal prisons, that because a private prison is trying to make profit and their profit scheme, like the business arrangement, is that they are charging per prisoner to the government. And so in order to profit, they have to spend less than what they're charging the government. So then they are trying to really like lowball on supplies. And so prisoners are talking about not having enough toilet paper, not having enough medical care, not getting enough. They're feeling neglected. It's not as good as the federal prisons.
Not that those are great to begin with. It's not...
I mean, I think it's a good rule of thumb to avoid prison in general.
I've heard that. Yeah. But like federal prisons skimp too.
And I'm sure they all have their faults.
Yeah.
Not someplace I really want to check out. But because there's a for-profit model in the private prison, they're really trying to skimp and make their profit margin as big as it can be. And so the prisoner is not their main concern. And there's actually this whole thing that happens where they charge the government for empty beds, which when I'm first reading about that sounds super, super sketchy, where like they're going to charge the government a fee for housing and caring for an inmate that doesn't exist. But then, as we discuss, the more that I looked into that, maybe it's not as sketchy as it sounds. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. At face value, like a lot of these private prisons have a quota that the government is required to pay, right? So the government, regardless of how many inmates are filling the prison, have to pay for, 95% of the beds, so to speak, whether or not there are prisons to fill them or not. And at first it seems kind of weird. It's like, okay, they are taking advantage of the government getting as much money as possible, but it's a risky business to open up a prison, right? It relies on people committing crimes for you to make money. And so it's, first of all, a weird business to even want to run, and it wouldn't be all that reliable. And so, like, in order to have these prisons that relieve the overpopulation in federal prisons or state prisons, there needs to be some kind of insurance that they will make X amount of money. So that's the first part. The second part is having that insurance, that 90% of beds being paid for. It means it doesn't incentivize these prisons to fill it with as many prisoners as possible.
Right.
They're getting paid no matter what. They're not incentivized to, not that they would crack down on crime, but maybe they would lobby the government or politicians to be, harsher on crime so they could make more money. And so this is kind of insurance against that as well. So it's not as sketchy as it sounds, although it's probably still a little sketchy.
But maybe it's kind of a good thing, like you're saying, so that they're not hungry to fill their beds by any means necessary so they can be making more money, right? Like, it's probably a lot more wise than it looks at first value, at face value.
Yeah, there's a few reasons to do it that way.
Yeah. And then, of course, just like anything that America does, I think other countries do it better.
Okay.
Have you read about New Zealand?
No, I haven't.
Jim, did you read about New Zealand in your research?
No, please enlighten me.
Okay. So their private prisons are really cool. They enter like competition with the government prisons in New Zealand. And so if the private prisons have lower recidivism rates, they get a bonus. Oh. If it's lower for the indigenous population, they get an extra bonus. And if they have unnecessary deaths, like prison violence, prison guard violence against prisoners, they get fines. And so there's like all these checks and balances to make sure that the private prisons are really doing a good job and there's incentive to do better than the government prisons.
Okay.
Isn't that cool?
That is actually interesting. I will give New Zealand that.
I think you should.
That's all they have going for them, those Kiwis.
You're so rude.
Well, that and Lord of the Rings. But yeah, I mean, that is an interesting way to incentivize to be better. We haven't talked about this yet, but in America, private prison inmates on average serve 90 additional days than prisoners in federal or state prisons. Why is that? Do we have an answer to why, on average, prisoners are serving longer terms in these private prisons?
I just kept seeing those statistics.
Yeah.
I don't know why. I wonder if hypothetically that is the trend. Maybe people with longer sentences might be sent there because private prisons claim that they can house these inmates at a lower cost. Okay. Is there some kind of rationale there?
They claim that, but the fact that they stay there longer kind of negates
any savings.
Some of the maybe not all of them, but like some of it. The longer you stay, the more expensive it is. So I don't know if these prisons are doing something to keep them there so they can make more money. But again, like, the government pays for... That's not actually universal, the government paying for like 90% of empty beds. So maybe in some of these cases, they don't have that insurance, and so they're trying to keep prisoners as long as possible. I'm not sure.
I don't know. What I can tell you is that I researched private prisons to see if it was as gross as it felt, and I came out saying, yeah, still pretty gross.
Okay. President Biden, I think it was last year, signed an executive order to try to phase out private prisons. The order directs the Justice Department to decline to renew contracts with private prisons. Okay, that would be going forward. It doesn't transfer inmates from private prisons to public prisons, and it still allows states to choose who they write contracts with. So they're not going away anytime soon. It's something that is going to continue to exist and probably will for quite a while unless any direct legislation comes through, which, there's nothing at the moment.
And to their credit, as of 2019, 20 states in the U.S. do not allow private prisons. So there's that. I hope that that's like a growing trend. I think that what we both found is that statistically, there's a lot less of them than it seemed. It seemed like that was a big issue, right? If the president's going to make this executive order, then it's probably a big deal, but it's actually a relatively low ratio of prisons that are private.
Yeah, I think it's 158 private prisons in America.
In all of America.
Which really doesn't sound like that much, and it represents 8% of all incarcerated people.
Actually quite small.
It is quite small, and we hear about private prisons in the news, on the media, Orange is the New Black, things like that, where it seems like it's a larger issue than it is. And for that 8% of incarcerated people, maybe it is a big issue, but in the grand scheme of the prison system, it's pretty small. It's not the root of all evil, like some people think. It's not great, but it's not the worst thing to ever exist.
But ethically, making profit off of prisoners is still feels wrong.
Yeah, it is. You are correct. Morally, it's gross.
Yeah.
Should it even happen? And I want to tell you a story.
Ooh.
Out of Pennsylvania. I read this story when I was researching this, and it kind of floored me, but did not shock me. This is called the Pennsylvania Kids for Cash scandal. Have you heard of this?
Kids for Cash sounds familiar.
Kids for Cash.
I don't know about the scandal.
This is from, a few years back, so it's kind of old at this point. But the story starts back in the early 2000s when two former judges in Pennsylvania closed a county juvenile detention facility and sent thousands of children to for-profit facilities in exchange for $2.8 million in kickbacks. And this was over the course of years. They sent thousands of kids to prison because the private prison was paying them off to do it.
For what possible reason?
A lot of minor things, like a lot of these kids were first-time offenders, minor drug things, jaywalking, stuff like this. I'm not kidding.
Jaywalking?
I'm not kidding. And this was only investigated because many of these children were convicted without counsel, and that raised some red flags. So these kids didn't even have lawyers.
That's terrible.
They weren't allowed to talk to their families before getting sent to jail.
Where were their private defenders? Their public defenders?
They got nothing.
Oh.
A lot of them, at least, were just sent straight to jail. So these two judges could make as much money as possible. And they did. They made $2.8 million.
Did they go to jail?
They did.
Thank
All's
God.
well that ends somewhat well. Those two judges are in jail. They have a lot of money to pay back to those thousands of children who are now adults and will probably not see so much money and certainly not make up for the damage that was done to them in their youth, like life-ruining stuff here.
Right.
But that was like...
formative time.
Yeah, no, it's horrible. That's the best time in these kids' lives, and they got ruined because these judges were greedy and because these private prisons wanted as many inmates as possible, and so they were paying off these judges. And so, having these private prisons kind of leads to situations like this. It's almost natural for someone who wants to make as much money as possible owning one of these prisons. Sometimes they're going to do what they got to do to make as much money. And so
that story literally made me sick to my stomach. That is the worst thing. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. And so that brings us back to the moral, ethical implications of private prisons.
You shouldn't profit off of someone being locked up. I feel like they committed a crime on average. A clearly wrongful, imprisonment happens.
Sure.
But that doesn't mean that you get to profit off of that person, whether it's them making license plates or bras or who knows what. I don't like it.
Yeah.
Especially, in media, TV shows, whatever, these prisoners are making pennies. And then their families are paying so much that they're going into debt just to call them. or put money on their accounts so they can have snacks or cigarettes or whatever. Like, it's definitely a flawed system overall. But I read that the for-profit prisons are more expensive to buy underwear or toiletries or phone calls, emails. All of those charges are more expensive when you're in a private prison.
They jack up those prices.
Yes.
Yeah, so they can make more money.
Yeah.
And so that brings us back to, is this a moral thing to do, to have private prisons?
I don't think so.
Profiting off inmates? Yeah, no, I'm with you. It's not ethical. Say what you want about it. Lowering the congestion of federal prisons? Okay, well, we can just build another prison to lower the congestion. Like if it's really that bad, the government can shell out a little more money to do that. That's the least they can do for imprisoning all these people.
And why not? They're giving money to the private prisons, so why not just build another one themselves?
It's kind of...
I don't understand the system.
Yeah, it's kind of like they can already afford it.
Yeah.
But, whatever. Red tape and building permits and zoning. I don't know. I don't know what the holdup is.
No, I don't understand.
So, in some ways, right, private prisons, they hold 8% of the inmate population. Is it as bad as the media makes it seem? No. That doesn't mean it's a moral thing to exist, and they probably shouldn't.
I agree.
Thank you all for listening to this episode of The Great Compromise. If you liked it, share it with your friends. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and Instagram. We really do appreciate it, and we will see you next week.